How important are these drugs to their current business and to expectations, 2026, 2027 and beyond?
Yeah, totally. I mean, as we can tell, incredibly important, as for the market reaction today, especially when it comes to Novo Nordisk. I mean, they have diabetes drugs and then they have these weight loss drugs, and that's pretty much it for that company. They've been around for a century, but their bread and butter is diabetes and weight loss. And when it comes to Lilly, Lilly's a little bit more diversified, but still Zepbound and Mounjaro are their biggest products. And when it comes to thinking about where these companies are going in the future, these drugs are pretty critical to that.
It was interesting to watch yesterday as President Trump was talking, because they didn't fall right away, and maybe it was just a little bit of a delay. But I was thinking, walk us through the math of these drugs. How much these firms have spent developing them, what they typically cost, and is he really going to be able to reduce the cost? And doesn't it? It's got to hurt them.
Yeah, and I mean that was the interesting thing. I think part of the delayed reaction was the fact that this was a press conference that was supposed to be about IVF.
Right.
And it was supposed to be about a deal with a completely different company, German Merck, which is EMD Serrano.
Which, to be honestly, I think I was like, wait, who are they? What are they?
Right. And I think people aren't super familiar with the name here. And then there's the confusion with American Merck, which has the, trademark to the Merck name. But these deals have been a really big deal. AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and then this is the third deal now that the administration has announced, and it was to lower the cost of fertility drugs. But these comments, these sort of offhanded comments that Trump made during the Q&A about lowering the cost of GLP-1s ended up sort of stealing the show. And I think that goes to show that these drugs are really important. They're really important to the companies, and the potential price reduction to 150, which again, we aren't 100% sure if these comments were made sort of offhandedly or if they could signal that these negotiations are going on behind the scenes with Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk. Some of those details are still a mystery to us, but the companies could take a big hit, because the difference with this obesity market as well is that, and we've talked about this, the insurance coverage is still pretty spotty. And so there's a massive cash pay market for these drugs, increasingly so. Eli Lilly has said that this cash pay market, people going to telehealth companies or going to Lilly Direct to get these drugs and pay $350 out of pocket, has made up an increasing share of new prescriptions of Zepbound, of total prescriptions of Zepbound. And so if you were to lower the price to $150, that's lower even than the cash pay price that they're offering. So it could potentially be a big deal.
Can I just ask you, how many people are just paying cash out of their pocket, and let's assume that they're doing it because they want to just lose weight? And then how many, this is also a drug used for people with diabetes. How much of the market is that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Lilly has said that about 20% of total Zepbound prescriptions are cash pay now. And for new prescriptions, it's an even bigger share. And so people are increasingly going to that as sort of like the first option. And there are millions and millions of people on these drugs, but the data also doesn't capture this whole compounding market, which has continued. The knockoff, off-brand versions of these drugs that are sold by a lot of telehealth companies is another major part of this market that's actually eaten into, especially Novo Nordisk's market share. And we still don't have good data about how many people exactly are taking advantage of that option. So this cash pay market is potentially even bigger than what the drug makers sort of have insight and awareness of from their own prescriptions.
And we're talking about the share moves in Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk after President Trump talking about lowering the cost of those drugs. Just want to talk about some headlines that quickly crossed the terminal just a few minutes ago. Supreme Court says it expects to run out of funding on October 18th, though it will continue essential work. So just keeping in mind, we're continuing to track the fallout of the current government shutdown. But just back to that topic, alongside Bloomberg News health reporter Madison Muller. Madison, $1,000 a month in the U.S. How does that compare to the costs for these drugs in other parts of the world? And if these prices do drop to $150, what does that mean for the distribution and kind of how these companies think about selling and marketing these drugs?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I mean, the price of Ozempic, this $1,000 price tag, has been something that Republicans and Democrats have been raising concerns about for over a year now. And it's sort of been, I think kind of the prime example of how U.S. drug prices are different than drug prices in other countries, just because people are so aware of Ozempic and what the price is. And there is a price discrepancy, and that's what Trump's whole most favored nation, these deals that he's striking with AstraZeneca, with Pfizer, and he's planning to with other companies, is all about, is aligning U.S. drug prices with those globally. And the reason why drug makers charge so much more in the United States is because they can. In other countries, the government's much more involved in price setting and negotiations around prices. And in the U.S., they haven't historically been. They have a couple different levers to pull now, but...
Yeah, well, just with that in mind, though, if this is all about kind of cozying up to the White House, you mentioned Novo Nordisk. This is where they operate. This is their business. Eli Lilly at least has other drugs. So does that then hurt Novo much more than it would Lilly if this is kind of the sacrificial lamb, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. They are also facing, they're sort of in a difficult and unique position because they're also under IRA negotiations, so the Inflation Reduction Act, which was rolled out under President Biden, and that gives the government negotiating power to cut the prices of some drugs in Medicare. So Novo is in this unique position because their drugs, Ozempic and Wegovy, were selected for those negotiations already this year. So the price of those drugs are already going to come down. Yeah. And we'll probably know by the end of this month, next month, sometime pretty soon, what the negotiated prices are. So that is happening in the backdrop of Trump trying to strike these other deals to lower drug prices. It's a little bit of they're in a difficult situation.
I always have a million more questions, but one thing I'm wondering is if this indeed happens, and I'm not quite sure how it happens, to be quite honest with you, but you do have the president saying this. Is there a chance that these companies back off on continuing their R&D in this field because it's maybe not as profitable as they thought it was?
It's a good question. I mean, it's something that I think at the beginning when Trump was first starting to threaten tariffs and most favored nation and all of these various actions on drug makers, we did see some CEOs saying, actually the CEO of Eli Lilly said he was concerned about R&D sort of being the first thing that gets hit. They've sort of since walked back some of those comments just because I think they're all in this negotiation period right now. However, I will say that the other deals that have been negotiated with Pfizer and AstraZeneca so far, the Wall Street's reaction has not been as severe as it was to the comments about GLP-1s, because the thought is that these companies already provide massive rebates through insurance, and so these price reductions might not actually be a big of a deal to their bottom line as it sounds like they are sort of in the press releases, but. Again, going back to Novo and Lilly, the situation is different because of this massive cash pay market and just the demand for these drugs. And when it comes to Novo, the sort of reliance that they have on these medications.